Hi there, Glocal citizens. Welcome back to the podcast that inspires a borderless mindset around manifesting a new world. I'm Florence Adu here in Accra, and I'm at a cute little spot called Thea. It's a little tea house restaurant in the airport residential area of Accra. And so you will be hearing the ambient noise of our environs, but we hope you enjoy sitting down with us today. My guest is the CEO and co-founder of nonprofit Crescendo Foods, Ghana's first commercial kitchen space and culinary hub based in Accra. She has over 10 years' experience leading programs, strategic partnerships, and economic evaluation initiatives throughout the African continent. Previously, she was a senior economic program advisor in the U.S. Department of State's Office of Global Women's Issues. During her first stint living in Accra in 2018, she founded Young Gifted and Brown LLC, a pipeline program supporting young Ghanaian women and entrepreneurs in STEM. In 2018, she was named by New America as one of 35 Black American national security and foreign policy next generation leaders. In 2019, Young Professionals in Foreign Policy named her the Gender Issues in Foreign Policy Fellow. A Food Science Fellowship Award endowment in her name was established in 2013 to provide fellowship funding for underrepresented graduate students in the Department of Food, Bioprocessing, and Nutrition Sciences at North Carolina State University. Dr. Wanida Lewis, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Florence. It's great to be here.
So let's get started. Let's get on the map with what we're talking about today. So first and foremost, where are you from? Where are you local? And what is your craft?
Sure. So my name is Dr. Wanida Lewis. Dr. W or Dr. Wani is what I'm called in Ghana. Mm-hmm. I was born in Philadelphia, raised in South Jersey. And I've been living in Accra now since 2020. I actually lived here before in 2018 and was moving my stuff over in 2019 and made the jump officially in 2020, way before the pandemic even came. And I actually live in West Legon, which is, not too far from University of Ghana, Legon. And my craft is agriculture, helping entrepreneurs, and yoga.
Yes. That's what, that wasn't in the bio, but I purposefully didn't put it in so we could sneak it into the conversation. Sure. A fellow yogi, yes, we have here indeed. Okay, so how did you come to be living, working, and playing here in Accra? So you had a stint before, so this is my why the where. Why the where? Why Ghana?
Right. So for me, I've always wanted to live outside of the U.S. It was never a point in my life where I'm like, all right, I'm going to be here for, be in America for the rest of my life. I think I've always saw myself as more transient. Mm-hmm. And I saw that throughout my career. And so I used to work for the U.S. Department of State. I was a AAAS fellow, which was specifically for early to late career professionals who are coming from more of a technical background and want to work in the U.S. government's executive branch. So I worked at the U.S. Department of State doing ag policy, and I would have never thought of being at state just because I didn't know what the State Department did at the time. I think a lot of Americans don't. They don't want to admit it. Mm-hmm. And they had an ag policy office and everything that I wanted to do, which was travel, because I was just coming out of my first kind of big girl job after finishing my PhD. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I want to travel. I loved traveling as a kid, more so as I should say as a teenager. Both of my parents have traveled, and I wanted to continue that life. So I did a lot of great achievements in the 2 years that I was at state as a AAAS fellow before working for the Women's Issues Office. And one of my big tasks was working on women in agriculture. And I knew about that life of being a woman in ag, being very few Black women in food science, just in general. Mm-hmm. And I created this gender strategy that the department, actually the bureau I was in, which was the Econ Bureau, they never had that before. Mm. So I laid out this entire strategy. It was like, these are the activities we need to do. So I launched this Women in Ag Policy Dialogue Series, which we connected women in DC to come and talk about different issues that they saw in ag, and then launched a broad, a much global platform where we were doing policy talks and workshops on the continent. So the first one was in Ethiopia, the second one was in Accra, Third one was in Pretoria, South Africa.
Okay.
And then we were going to have a fourth one in Monrovia, Liberia.
Okay.
And when I came to Accra in 2017, I, was here for a week and a half. You don't really get a chance to see anything because you're working on the conference the whole time.
Right.
It was just a one-day workshop. And this one lady came up to me, the boss of the office I ended up working in at that later on that year, or the next year. She said, how do you feel about coming to live in Accra for a couple months? And I was like, well, I mean, hey, I'm not married, I don't have any kids, then sure, I'll go ahead and do it. And I moved here in 2018, and I worked with women in ag, women in STEM, a lot of entrepreneurs, which is where I was able to, launch a Young Gifted program through the embassy.
Oh, wow.
And and that had never been done before. And I said, you know what, like Ghana, I felt very free here. I was just be able to experience a different life. But I will also say the caveat is I've traveled to other countries, right? And I was able to see, compare and contrast what I wanted. Also thinking of if I need to go home, how can I get home very quickly? Because my parents are still on the East Coast, and stuff like that. And at the time, well, they have it now, but definitely back then they had that direct flight from South Africa Airlines that went from DC to here. Was a 9-hour flight. So it wasn't that big of a deal. And also too, like my French isn't as great as I would like for it to be. So it came to Ghana. And I also have family that comes back and forth. My cousin's husband is Ghanaian. Okay. And I was actually supposed to come to Ghana in 2013 after finishing my PhD as a graduation gift, but it didn't come into fruition. So the funny thing is when I came, he was here visiting family, and we were able to meet.
Oh, nice. So you got a little bit of the local experience.
Yeah, definitely,
right?
definitely. And anytime he comes to town, he's in his 70s, I go by and I see him. And then, and then his daughter, we're a year apart. Okay. I'm older, so she'll be here like Christmas time. Oh, nice. And we'll be able to hang out as adults like in Ghana.
Sure. Oh, wow. Okay, that's very cool. So what is the AAAS
It's
program?
The American Association for the Advancement of Science.
Okay.
So they're an organization in D.C., and they have these science policy They have different fellowships, like for people who are interested in media, communications. But I applied to the Science and Technology Policy Fellowship. It's very hard to get into. It's specifically for American, I think, citizens. Yeah, American citizens. I was going to say you can be a dual citizen, but if you're working at the State Department, you got to go through security clearance, and that can take forever, even if you haven't gone anywhere.
Sure.
But it was interesting. Like a lot of my friends were dual citizens, and then that I work with at the State Department. Their parents are maybe Middle Eastern and something. Right.
Oh, interesting. Okay, and then my understanding a lot of times is a lot of people who work in these kinds of roles are part of the Foreign Service. So that was not part of your story, right? Okay.
I was civil servant. I was definitely courted to be a Foreign Service officer. Right. Especially from other people of color. And they're like, oh,
we need
join the Foreign Service. You're doing all this great work.
Yeah.
And I did a lot of things outside of the State Department. I was a German Marshall Fund Marshall Memorial Fellow as well in 2015 before I joined the State Department, and that allowed me to go to Europe for a month with another cohort. That was an even bigger feat at the time because they really they're very strict of who they pick. And as a result of that, I wanted to launch a transatlantic, because they specifically focus on transatlantic relationships. So the U.S. and Europe and Eastern Europe. Okay. And I think they're now expanding into other countries outside of those two continents. Okay. And I launched myself and a sorority sister of mine who was also in my cohort, we launched the Transatlantic Women of Color Conference, where we connected, working with GMF, we connected with all these women who were, we had like Senator Shirley Jackson Lee.
Oh, okay.
Who always has the big hairstyle. So we had her come. We had Linda Thomas Greenfield. She came. So, we had some like heavy hitters. Gina Abercrombie Winstanley, who's now the DEI expert for the U.S. Department of State. It was a great, time, and we did it twice, So the thing is, I think when you're in these roles, there's so many, there's way to be in this world without having to be associated with the government. Because at that time, I was just waiting for security clearance. I was just coming out of private sector. Right. Me, a girl working on Toaster Strudel, was able to launch, launch this and be able to, bring, for me, it's always about making sure people are, it's inclusive, and especially for Black women.
Yeah. Nice. Okay, so I purposely didn't talk about your degrees because I wanted you to talk about your degrees and your relationship to STEM. So tell us more about your background and inspiration for even kind of coming to your craft.
So it's funny, I'm the only scientist in my family. My sister is an architect. My mother is a retired music teacher. Found out years later she wanted to be a chemist.
Oh.
My dad is is also retired recreational therapist and moonlights as a photographer as his passion. And you know, for me, it's the importance of humanities, right? A lot of the times, people think that if you come from a technical background, you come from a technical family. We're all very analytical in our own way, but definitely very creative. And you know, I had the microscope, I had a telescope as a kid. I didn't go to any STEM camps. You know, I was in music because I have a music teacher mother,
right.
And I played professionally. I was classically trained to play the French horn. So I competed. I did all these things. And I have a cousin who was a surgeon, and I thought what he did was so cool. And that's when Ben Carson was really like at the peak of his career. And I was like, I'm going to be a pediatric neurosurgeon. And I decided, you know, when it came to college, like, yeah, I applied to like the Georgetown. I applied to, you know, other institutions, but I really felt like I wanted to go to a historically black college. And I did. I went to St. Augustine's College, now University, and it was one of the, you know, it was funny because at first I was like, I don't want to be in North Carolina. I wanted to be like in Atlanta. Yeah, you know, it was like year 2000, you know, 2001. I was like, I want to be in Atlanta. And I remember my mom saying to me, give it a year. If you don't like it, then you can transfer.
Sure.
And of course, you know, most people, when they get exposed to, you know, HBCU homecomings, you're like, you know what? I actually like where I'm at.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
And I was actually going to major in psychology.
No, why?
Because my cousin, who was the surgeon, was like, major in psychology. You can take all the STEM classes you can, and they'll just help you.
Okay,
you know,
understand that space.
Yeah,
right,
and then it's an easy. You know, it's a little bit easier because I think everybody assumes they need to apply. You know, be in a STEM field. He's like, no, like, I have a psychology degree. He's like, I went to University of Michigan, like, you know, a really like amazing school, right? Especially for him being like a really good surgeon, and he was, you know, later on he was on the board for Howard's Hospital, and then decided to go back into practicing because he was like, administration is not my thing. And so I majored in psychology, and then before I left, I was also on a band scholarship, and my band director, who has...
Wait, so you had a band scholarship to university?
Yes, to St. Aug.
This is a real musician here.
Yeah.
Right.
I had a band scholarship or orchestra scholarship.
Yeah.
And, you know, he said to me, have you thought about majoring in chemistry? And I was like, what? Chemistry? I mean, I like chemistry. It's cool. And then he's like, you know, they have money available. I was like, well, you know, okay, we'll see what happens. And that helped me to have a full ride to St. Aug. And I majored in chemistry. And when I finished, that was a long life. It was like 4 years. And I was like, I'm tired of lab. And when it came down to grad school, I had a job opportunity to work for the ATF, which is the Tobacco and Firearm, or Agency for Tobacco and Firearm, or something in DC. And I just knew I was going to be the hot stuff, because I was like, oh, I'm going to be making $30,000. And you know, it's 2005. I'm like, I could afford that. And I remember my parents like, can you really afford that? It's like $30,000.
That wasn't a lot.
It wasn't a lot at all. So I decided to apply for grad programs. And I was just like putzing around, like, oh, maybe I'm going to get a master's in engineering. I'm not an engineering mind. I'm very creative.
Sure.
And my band director came to the rescue and was like, okay, well, why don't you apply to North Carolina Central? It's another HBCU. It's 30 minutes away, actually. It was in Durham. And I said, okay, and maybe I'll apply to get a master's in chemistry or something. And I applied to, I think I was getting ready to apply to Tuskegee, and I'm just so glad I didn't do that, because I was like, oof, I've been to Alabama 2 to 3 times since then, and I was like, I know my level of rural. I mean, I have great friends who went to Tuskegee. They had an amazing experience.
Sure.
And I was like, let me stick to the lakes and the rivers that I'm used to, and I'm cool with Raleigh. And so I ended up moving to Durham. I got my master's in chemistry.
Okay.
And, decided, I mean, I had decided in undergrad, I was like, I don't want to be a pediatric neurosurgeon anymore. And I ended up having an internship, ended up being a 2-year internship, working in food science, doing product development, and I worked with the only Black professor at NC State. And so he became a mentor, still is to this day.
Sure.
And, when it came to me changing my master's thesis, because I was doing drug design, and I was like, I actually like food. So I did a project on wine for like an advanced thermodynamics class.
Interesting.
Yeah, which is so funny because I was like, I would have never thought I would like advanced thermodynamics. But I
get it though. I like thermodynamics.
Really?
Yeah. Well, so I'm an engineer.
Oh yeah.
And so my material science class, that part of it, I was like, ooh, I really like this. Like that was one of my favorite. Probably one of my most favorite like real engineering courses, because I didn't major in like engineering. I majored in, now they call it management science and engineering.
Okay.
So it was industrial engineering.
Gotcha.
So basically we did a general, you could choose which classes, and material science was just interesting to me and I loved it. So yeah, I get the
And I hated PChem too. Any like quantum mechanics.
Yeah.
It's like there's not a real answer. If you're telling me my only response is 0, 1, or infinity, there's nothing I can do about that. And
it is tricky.
Yeah, it's very tricky. And yeah, so I was like, this isn't my thing. It's not my thing. So I decided to get my PhD, and I was thinking about getting my PhD in chemistry, and I said, why don't I just get my PhD in food science? And I decided to, attend NC State with my mentor, being a part of my dissertation committee. And I graduated in 2013, which seems so long ago. I finished in 2012, but graduated in 2013, and then went to go work in product development at General Mills for 3.5 years.
So that makes a lot of sense. So that transition makes a lot of sense. So, but let me ask you, what is a food scientist?
It's not easy. It's not
exactly.
It depends. A lot of times when people hear food scientists, they think nutritionist. And food science, it can be 4 or 5 different things. It's usually, you could either be a nutritionist, a food chemist, which they look at the chemical compounds that make up, a flavor, that can make up a food, that can look at why these things are synergistic and not. Sure. There's food bioprocessors. They're looking at the processing of everything. Then there's food engineering. And then the food microbiologists. And those people look at the outbreaks. They can look at pathogens. Why is there typhoid? What happens when you like food, and that gets into like food safety. And so even though my 2 degrees are in chemistry, I was kind of turning it more to a biochemist, because I looked at the effects on the body. That was my master's thesis, looking at the effects of grapes, and it was looking at compounds within grapes. Yeah. And then when I got to my PhD, I looked at the compounds within the peanut, or they say groundnut here, skin. And that's that red thin paper layer that we throw away in the States. Right. And so that's what I did. And so I was looking at stuff on a molecular, biological level. Sure. So I always say I'm more of a food biochemist for me, but I mean, to do product development, everybody has to take a product development class. And that just means like understanding, why these things go together, why these ingredients do this, and you have to understand all of these things. Yeah. Right? Like, so food science may be very broad, you can be very specific, but you have to understand or have the basic knowledge of food chemistry. Right. And my biggest issue when I took a food chemistry class was I was used to doing drug synthesis. So I knew how to go all the way to the end of the product, to get the yield. And my food chemistry class, they only went to like step 2. So it used to be the bane of my existence. And I had to alter my mind, but it helped me understand, like, okay, this is what you need to do X, Y, and Z. Like, a lot of people aren't great bakers. Baking is not easy. Sure. Baking is literally a science. Yeah. Yeah, it's a science. Yeah. For sure. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. That's very interesting. So what was one of your favorite projects or products that you worked on in that role at General Mills? Oh, man. You know what? I probably said I didn't have one. I mean, I worked on biscuits. I worked on toaster strudel dough. I worked on icing. I think maybe it was the biscuits, because we had blueberry biscuits.
Blueberry?
And, yeah.
Oh, okay, so was it the mix or the actual?
The actual, like, I did frozen dough. Oh. So there's the mix. There was the mix
yeah, the ones that you roll out.
Yeah, and we did. Yeah, so I didn't work in the mixing. I was frozen baked goods. So I worked in frozen stuff.
Okay.
And it was cool when you got a chance to do product innovation because you could buy stuff from different competitors and then do your compare and contrast and be like, okay, this is actually what I want to create.
Yeah.
I remember I was trying to work on a sweet potato biscuit at one point because that was like a big thing in the South.
Okay, right.
And so, yeah, it was cool. I mean, I will say I enjoyed working with various partners. I worked with a company in Toronto. Even to this day, I have a relationship with them.
Okay.
But it was cool. I mean, it was an interesting time, like working in a baked good industry. It could be very fattening because I knew people in the cookie department, people in frosting.
You never had to really get lunch or breakfast.
Well, yeah. I mean, but after a while, you're like, I'm not going to eat
too much sugar.
Yeah, too much sugar. But you would smell bread as you walked in. But if I had to go to a party, I didn't buy anything. I just called somebody and say, hey, what do you have extra inventory of? Sure. Yeah, just come down and get such and such. Or it would be a situation where, they would have giveaways.
Right.
We're giving away, hey, there's free bread, take a loaf. And if you're like, oh, well, I'm actually making spaghetti tonight, let me go ahead and grab that.
Sure.
So.
Yeah, that sounds so cool. So okay. So you're in this food science space, you're in the baked goods space, and then you transition. So you mentioned how you kind of started to get into this policy side. Mm-hmm. So how does a product developer now become a policy scientist?
That part was it can be difficult because when you're coming from, I would even say, even back it up from there, coming from grad school to working in corporate America is very different. Mm-hmm. In grad school, we're taught to tell a story and, and you're telling the facts and figures. But when you come to corporate America or a business environment, they just want to know how much it's going to cost.
Yeah.
And then when you go to a policy, they want to, depending on what side of it you're on, if you're in impact or, you're doing diplomacy, they want a little bit more, you have to go back to having that fluff.
Yeah.
And at the time, it was under the Obama administration. It was the very tail end. So everybody's like, oh, tell me a story. And then, when it was the Trump administration, that was interesting because a lot of my colleagues struggled. They were so used to being able, because you get the same type of politicians all the time where it's like, tell me a story. And it's like, well, these people are business folks. They want to know how much it's going to cost. They want to know the bottom line. And so I would definitely say I struggled through both. For me, policy was a little bit easier, but I had a great mentor. I think at any job, if you have a great mentor, it helps your life so much.
Right.
And because I was used to doing writing back in grad school, I was used to writing papers. Sure. So it wasn't, but you're not going to write a 10 to 15 page policy paper. You may write maybe 2 pages. Yep. And, you're trying to gather all these things. I think what I had to learn, the one thing I wouldn't say struggled, but had to wrap my head around was the amount of time. Mm-hmm. Because in grad school, you may have months or weeks, and most of the time, depending on what your issue is in the government, it may be a matter of minutes or days. Yeah. You may get a week. That's lucky. Yeah. And that means that if you have a week, that includes everybody's approval. Yes. And what was cool is that you would get an email from somebody that says, I need you're okay. And it'd be like one word in this entire 20-page document. And you're like, that's all, or you would add in whatever. So I would definitely say I was fortunate because my mentor was also a former AAAS fellow. Okay. Mm-hmm. She was a desk officer, and that's more intense because they were focusing on one country and and all their issues. And if you have somebody that's kind of laid back, it's maybe not too bad. But I think she worked in Iran, so it was in the 90s. Activity, right? Yeah, and in the 90s, so it was just a lot. Yeah. So it just really depends. But she was a great mentor and just helped me meet whoever I needed to meet. Told me to ask as many questions I needed to ask. No question was stupid. And I tried to do a jump into policy at General Mills, but it wasn't very helpful because I didn't have the right people in my corner to see me be successful in that space. But at the same time, it's I also knew I didn't want to live in Minneapolis for a long period of time.
Okay, got it. So how long were you there?
3.5 years.
Okay, all right. And so from Minneapolis, you came
to DC,
right? And so then that's where you were the fellowship. So your transition was in the fellowship space.
Yeah, right. Except for General Mills was probably the first job that I actually had to apply for. I applied for jobs, but actually go through an interview, being flying, where they flew out, flew out somewhere. They packed up my stuff and moved me.
Oh, wow.
It was nice.
You got a whole package.
Yeah, I had a whole package. I had a signing bonus. And when I moved to DC, I called my friends over and I was like, listen, I'm ordering pizza. Can you help me pack my crap? And I put my stuff on this truck and
drove it across the country.
No, I didn't even drive. I said I refused.
They movers did it.
Yeah, well, I hired some movers to move me, and I was like, and I had it at my parents' house until my clearance was almost done.
Okay.
Because during that time, I wanted to finish up my yoga teacher training because I started it.
Right.
My last year being in Minnesota, so I was like, let me just finish up doing what I need to do, and then I'll go. Okay. And then that's exactly what I did. So it was interesting, like just having to go through all of that. I don't have any regrets. I mean, maybe one or two that's like, oh, I should have really finished up my French training when I was in grad school. But, other than that, I took a policy class in grad school. I wasn't that interested, but I was like, it can't be that hard.
It wasn't, was it?
No, policy is really not that hard. I mean, if you're trying to be inclusive, it's a little bit harder because you're trying to satisfy everybody. But, I think also you have to just be realistic if you're trying to really be effective.
Yes. That is true. And I think as a policy professional, I feel like there probably should be a little bit more attention paid to that craft in itself in so many sectors, right? Because I think a lot of private sector corporates, they don't necessarily recognize that policy is people at the end of the day. And so to make that connection between what it is that you're doing and the impact, there is this kind of nuance of how do you actually craft it and implement. Right. And so I think a lot of policy falls very short on the implementation side, because I remember in most of my experience, much of my experience, we do the research, we talk to a lot of people, and then we come out with a policy, and then there were never enough resources to really implement these policies. And I feel like that is exactly the challenge that we're facing in Africa and most developing economies, is that there's this great, effort to make policy, but there's no effort to make sure that there are trained professionals to be able to actually implement and track and ensure the results.
Yeah, and from a developed side is that we give money to the same people. Yes. And they don't really actually implement. So you see, it's the same issue, but different. And the thing is, too, when it comes to gender, that's always added at the end, and then people skimp on it because they're like, oh, yeah, I guess we should consider the women and girls, but the money has already been set, and gender should have been at the very top. Right. As you're listing your policies, how does it affect all the players, to your point? Right. So it's always interesting because when I got into the women's economic empowerment space, that's one thing I always would see. It's like, everybody's so worried about all the little boys and the men, and it's like, well, they won't have anybody to talk to if women aren't carried along. And then, you also hear the argument in the U.S. where there's always stuff for men, for women, and there's nothing for guys. And I think it's just a matter of how you look at the issue. There are a lot of programs that are a lot more women focused. Yep. But I think the thing is that we also have to change our narrative where, well, why can't men have that too? Why are we only allowing women to be, soft and open, and we're not encouraging young men and older men to also be to talk about their own emotions. Right. We're starting to see a lot. You see that internal struggle with a lot of people, but you're starting to see that specifically within men. Yeah. And how does that and what does that work in a policy perspective, right? So thinking about actually both people being equal, which is what people don't think about either. Sure. Like somebody's always better than somebody, or someone's always being more oppressed, which that does happen. I would never say, oh no, but no, it's like we don't look at we don't look at the same issue, but we don't think about how it's expressed differently. Women are oppressed because why? X, Y, and Z. Well, why do men feel that way? Well, let's talk about the societal issue of where that comes from, and actually we're looking at that. So here we are.
Well, fortunately, we have this whole new space in the DEI space that I think is really focused on doing that work. So I think the next 3 to 5 years are going to be an interesting time to watch in whether or not there was actual muscle behind the DEI.
Yeah, because a lot of people are just putting money towards it like they do everything.
Yes.
You know, and it's
Exactly.
like, yeah, I had DEI training. I don't remember anything about it.
Exactly.
Or we had a EDI. No, so now somebody's dyslexic. Okay, so y'all didn't get that. You're like, that's not the same training.
Right.
You know, or they just
Right.
hire somebody.
Yeah.
Just to hire them is what all
Yeah.
maybe sometimes it's just moving someone to another space, and it's
Yes.
even it doesn't make sense if you have DEI, you hire an African American woman who happens to be queer, who happens to not be married, who may have a child, and it's like
Yeah.
you're checking off all the boxes instead of actually creating this well-rounded
Sure.
team.
Exactly. So we shall see. I've been having quite a few conversations with professionals in that space, and they're busy.
Yeah.
They are really busy. And I asked the question about, so what's the after? And so, I mean,
We'll see.
we'll see. So I'm glad you brought up started to segue into your work here in Ghana. And so you started working in the policy space, and I'm assuming you're still doing a little bit of that. But how did you now come to your brainchild, your entrepreneurship in Crescendo?
So for me, when I was working in the ag policy space, they would have these panels where they would bring professionals from all around the world to do a tour of the U.S. government branches, and they would always go to state first. Because they're like, they ask all these questions, like, no, that's USDA, no, that's Treasury, or no, that's whoever. And we would always get women in ag, and so I would always be the ag representative for my company, for my office at the time. And I always heard the same thing of like, oh, I don't have a place to scale up my production. I'm always stuck doing stuff in my home, or I don't have the money to be able to buy the equipment that I need. Now, going back to 2015, when I did this German Marshall Fund, the GMF stuff, after we were done, I took a trip to Amsterdam to see a good friend of mine, and I saw a store that had a different menu by a different vendor every night, and you just placed your order in and you came and picked it up.
I love that.
And I was like, oh, that would be cool to be able to implement in the States, but making it something for Black and brown, companies. And I thought about it, and then after having worked in Ghana in 2018 and meeting women from different parts of the continent at this point in time, telling me about X, Y, and Z, I said, if I ever got a chance to come back to Ghana, maybe I'll start it. And, you think of it in a way where like, oh, I'll start it when I have like another job that's doing X, Y, and Z. And then the pandemic happened, and I was like, now's the time.
Right.
And so at first we were a shared, strictly shared commercial kitchen spaces.
Okay.
And I thought like that's what I'm going to do. And then I started to see gaps within the incubators that were here in Ghana.
No, when you say the incubators, the food incubators, or just generally incubators?
General incubators.
Yeah.
Now, there is an ag incubator here, so I would never say there aren't any ag incubators. That's not true.
Okay.
But they do a lot more training, right?
Okay.
There aren't any commercial kitchen spaces. And the reason why we're tackling commercial kitchen spaces is because when you think about it, if you're a person who's a caterer, you want to try to expand your business. A lot of people want to get into the exporting business of their food. And you need a certain type of equipment that can cost you, anywhere from 20,000 USD to over 100,000, depending on what you're trying to do. And I decided, all right, well, we can do a mixture of both. And really the idea has evolved. And the term crescendo really is kind of a tribute to my own personal background, right?
Now it makes sense.
Yes, now it makes sense, right? Crescendo in music theory means to gradually increase.
Yeah.
And so I threw a food boot camp for up-and-coming entrepreneurs in 2021.
Okay.
And that was the beginning of it. And we were really remote for the whole year, putting together these workshops. We launched an e-course for people who wanted to enter into the Ghana food industry. We have an ebook for that. We're actually getting ready to launch that course now in Google Classroom for, nice. In the beginning of 2023. And of course, the biggest thing here is always space. And so, I felt it was, since we have been working with a lot of chefs, we work with a lot of food restaurants, caterers, and sometimes they just ask me to consult on product development, or somebody may ask, hey, I need a chef, do you know anybody? Or, a chef may say, I need your help helping me to plan an event. So we do all these things, and really what I thought about is what Crescendo is that we're actually all these things. like, yeah, you can come in and use the shared commercial kitchen space, but you can also go through a training. You can also just ask us to help, or sometimes you just need an event space, and then also thinking about it from the perspective of what if you don't even do any of these things. So we are now launching like a shared co-working space of just desk and stuff for people, and because we're in West Legon, there's nothing over there.
Right.
So it helps out a lot. Also, you just may want to sit and eat. And so we're combining things together that if you're a commercial, if you're a restaurant and you need a place to set up during the day, we have customers who can purchase your food. Because a lot of these incubators, you got to leave and bring your, if anything, it may just be a person that you don't want to eat from, and we'll have multiple vendors in one space.
That's nice.
So,
great idea.
Yeah. So definitely, we're launching. We're in the middle of renovations and all that, and hoping to launch our space, Lord willing, next month.
Okay.
But it's been fun. It's also hard because, it's something new. You don't have anyone else to ask. I mean, you could ask some of these tech incubators, and then their mind starts to think like, well,
you're trying to take over my territory.
In a way, but then they're like, not really. And a lot of them just do trainings, but they don't actually do specific food trainings. It's always about farming.
Yes.
Everybody focuses on farming.
Yes.
Everyone focuses on import export. It's not saying those things aren't important.
Yes.
But we focus on food service.
Oh,
so
okay,
we actually focus on people who are doing
hospitality in a lot of ways.
Yes. And we don't do customer service.
Right.
But we're talking about food safety.
Yeah.
We're talking about product development, recipe cost.
So like if you're planning a restaurant, you need to understand like this is what it's going to cost you on an ongoing basis.
Yes.
To serve these kinds of meals.
And or even if you're a baker.
Yeah.
And you're just a baker. So we really get into the technical part, and that allows me to be able to be creative and also to use my expertise and my network of pulling people together. And, a lot of times people come in the space, they'll have foreigners out the wazoo. And I'm like, there's plenty of food scientists who are in Ghana. You just have to find them. And I know a couple of them.
Sure.
So we kind of rely on each other to tell each other what's going on, but also I bring them in to help them. They end up meeting other clients or, or just someone who's interested in that space. And some people don't even know there's like what does Nestle do? Well, Nestle definitely does have product developers here.
Right.
And you just have to find them. So it's been a very rewarding, yet stressful venture. But, once we launch, I know it's going to be crazy, but we've had events. We hosted Jadena. When he came here, we did a private dinner. We did a collaboration with a chef. We're actually getting ready to host a few universities that are doing study abroad programs here in food.
Nice.
So doing some, so it's not, yes, there's people like, I just want a nice fry. And the thing is, even if we do these events, we're not just putting together local food and it's served on a plate. It's like, it's really a fine dining experience, which you don't see in the local space. So, a lot of the time it's more foreign.
Right.
So we're actually trying to have a space specifically for chefs who
are doing indigenous kinds of meals.
Yeah, indigenous. They want to have the whole fancy napkin, or they're doing their own fusion, and that's not a wedding, because that's the other thing. The only time we see that is at a wedding, and this may just be like, hey, I just want to expose it to a group of people who have the money to afford it. And so we really have created this niche space of what we're doing. And then when it comes to people who have kids, we'll be launching like classes for kids.
That's great.
Yeah.
And we're exciting. Yeah.
So lots of food. We're actually our hope is to do something for Thanksgiving. We're calling it Friendsgiving.
Okay.
We'll be having a Friendsgiving thing coming up in November, and probably a cookie exchange, because I used to do Christmas cookie exchanges all the time.
Okay, that sounds great. Thanks for joining us for part 1 of my conversation with Dr. Wanida Lewis. Be sure to come back next time when you'll learn a lot more about Dr. Wanida's journey in Ghana, in the U.S., and as a yogi. And as always, please do catch us each and every Tuesday with new episodes at glocalcitizenspod.com or wherever you get your podcasts. Apple, Google, Spotify, Amazon. You get the drift. Like, share, subscribe. Leave us a review, please. And until next time, bye for now.